My name is Sarah Turing, and I'm the outgoing president of the Emory University School of Law ACS chapter. And it is my great privilege to introduce our luncheon speaker today, a founder of the National Stonewall Democrats, U.S. Representative Barney Frank.
Yeah.
Throughout Representative Frank's long and distinguished career in public service, he has fought for and embodied the fundamental principles of human rights, human dignity and equality, and access to justice. After graduating magna cum laude from Harvard University and cum laude from Harvard University Law School, Representative Frank served in state and local government, including 8 years as a Massachusetts state representative, 3 years as Chief Assistant to Mayor Kevin White of Boston. In 1980, Mr. Frank was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives, where he is now the ranking minority leader on the House Financial Services Committee. During his tenure in Congress, Representative Frank has worked to diminish economic inequality, increase the stock of affordable housing, expand America's civil rights laws, improve legal protections against discrimination of all kinds, enhance access to health care, implement meaningful environmental protection laws, press for human rights around the world, bring fairness to U.S. immigration law, address the inequalities that result from economic globalization, and work toward an overall political climate which respects an American citizenry of diverse ethnicities, genders, sexual orientations, and economic classes. Moreover, after a 2004 survey of Capitol Hill staffers, Mr. Frank was voted, quote, the smartest and funniest member of Congress simultaneously, which gives him the power to influence every member in the House on every issue. When Barney Frank talks to members, even the Republicans tend to start repeating what he says. Please join me in welcoming Representative Frank.
Thank you for reading what, if my office gave you, will be shortened way too long, but I thank you. I'm very pleased to see this turnout. You are an organization with a very important mission, and so I am very encouraged to see the people who are here. I'm also delighted to have in the audience one of my colleagues who is as good a civil libertarian who has ever served in the Congress, Bobby Scott from Virginia. So it's great to be here with Bobby. I want to give you what I think are some of the best arguments we can use as we take the fight to the right wing. That is a fight which is turning in our direction, and indeed on a set of issues which are especially relevant to what you do. I believe when political history is written 5, 10 years from now, I'm hoping that we will see the last couple of years as a turning point with regard to people's fear of the right. Look, just a little political history. After the Republicans won the elections of 2002 and 2004, and even with vote counting shenanigans, they won. The fear was that this was an endorsement by a majority in the country of the whole right-wing agenda, including the social agenda, including the whole set of legal issues that many people here focus on. And a lot of people on the Democratic side believed that, even though they didn't want to say it. So that at the end of 2004, there was a fear that this right-wing ideological agenda was on a roll. It's been stopped. They are on the defensive with the agenda. They are trying to change the subject. I think it is now clear that the reason for their winning in 2002 and 2004 was overwhelmingly the national security issue, their successful manipulation of it, the initial popularity of the war in Iraq, and this notion that they could protect us. I do not think that the other issues were in any way responsible for their winning. And in fact, I think it is their overreach on that set of issues that is helping us win things back from the right wing. And in that regard, I really believe that the issue that will be seen historically as one of the turning points is the case of Terry Schiavo. In March of 2005, the perception among the political community was that the Republicans had done it to us again, and particularly the conservatives. They had come up with an issue where we on the liberal side disagreed, but we were going to get hammered by the country because we were going to be on the wrong side. We were going to be the unsympathetic, heartless people who were going to literally pull the plug on poor Terry Schiavo over the objection of her understandably grieving parents. When the Schiavo bill came up in April, I can tell you that the prevailing view among Democrats was, oh God, they've boxed us in. The United States Senate passed that bill on an apparently unanimous voice vote. Now, the Senate being a wonderful institution that it is, by my count, a majority of the senators are now on record against the bill that they passed unanimously, which you have the virtue of doing when it's a voice vote. In the House, the leadership was clearly preferring that we not make an issue of it. We did debate it in the House. The first sign that the right wing was happier about it than the left wing was a lot of the Democrats didn't show up. You had the option of not showing up. It was on a Sunday night. It was easy to explain why you wouldn't be there. But many more, in percentage terms, Republicans than Democrats showed up. And the vote, the Democrats had a bare majority against it. On the floor of the House that night, at least 6 Democrats said to me, boy, you're right, this is a bad bill, but I better vote for it. In other words, the perception was the right wing, once again, has a popular issue. The next day, the tornado hit. In my experience, nothing has angered the American people as much as the Schiavo case in a very long time. I had the personal experience that I haven't had since the Clinton impeachment of people stopping me on the street and saying, thank you, those people are scary. And they scared the American people with the Schiavo case. And what you saw, for example, was an appreciation of the importance of the separation of powers. People did understand that there are things that the legislative body shouldn't do. People were grateful that they had courts that were not subject to the electoral process. I mean, my summary, which I found the easiest to explain to people, was it's a 2-part question. One, do you think the kind of question involved in the decision about whether or not to continue Terry Schiavo in that pitiful state she was in should be decided by politicians? And if the answer to that is no, then why do you ask 535 politicians to decide it, which is the Congress of the United States? And I think the Schiavo case has really crystallized for people what the problem was. Now, we need to be clear about what that is. I believe the conservatives have the role of government exactly backwards. They want the government to be involved when it shouldn't be, and the government, in their view, should be absent when we need it. And that's, by the way, how we should respond on this question of morality in politics. Some on the left have, I think, mistakenly said, oh no, we're against this morality in politics. And there has been an argument that we should not allow people to inject morality into politics. I would hope that everybody in this room who's involved politically was here precisely because you have a set of moral principles that you think the political system ought to implement. Of course we're for morality in politics. We do not think it is morally appropriate to have people go without health care, for people to be the victims of discrimination. There are a whole number of things we do for which we are driven morally. The problem with the fundamentalists and the right wing is not that they want to inject morality into politics, it's that they want to inject politics into private lives. The problem is that when they talk morality in every case, they are talking about injecting the government into decisions that shouldn't be any of the government's business. Who to express intimacy with, what a woman should do when she's pregnant, how, when, and whether to pray, what to read, what to see on the internet, how to react if someone says shit on television. All of those are, I think, issues which we can deal with by ourselves. we do not need to invite the government in to deal with it. But we reject that not because they are injecting morality into politics. In every case, those who disagree with me, I understand, have a moral basis for their view. But it is not the set of moral issues that ought to be coercively applied to others. People have a right to make their own moral judgments about these things that affect individuals. And, some questions are hard, but I still think John Stuart Mill got it right 150 or so years ago. If it primarily affects you, it's none of the government's business. When you start impinging on somebody else, then it is the government's business. Now, I wish some of my liberal friends were more consistent about that. A lot of liberals are all for that unless it comes to gambling. Gambling, you should understand, is to liberals what pornography is to conservatives. It is an activity of which they morally disapprove and think is tacky, so they therefore think the government can ban it, even though it does no conceivable harm to anybody who doesn't choose to engage in it voluntarily. But we should be very clear what the principle is. The principle that we are objecting to is not that they are taking their moral principles and putting them into politics. It is that they are entering through government a sphere that ought to remain private. And where government is involved, of course we want things to be moral. Racial and sexual orientation discrimination and hungry children and a fouled environment that sickens people, all of these things are immoral. Gross corruption in the corporate system that means that people are going to wind up not getting the pensions that they were supposed to get, those are all immoral. Let's not concede to our opponents on the fundamentalist right the view that they're the moral ones. They're the intrusive ones. Indeed, I think my major, it dawned on me one day that with this administration, we get the worst of both worlds. The economics of Calvin Coolidge and the social outlook of William Jennings Bryan. It's a very potently negative combination. Next thing we have to do is to take head on their argument that they are opposed to activism and that they embody the view that important decisions should be made through the democratic process rather than through judges. Let's be very clear that the degree of result orientation is as strong on the right as it is on the left. And by the way, I don't object to people being result-oriented. I object only to people being result-oriented and pretending that they aren't. People are always looking for some kind of neutral principle with which to clothe their policy preferences, and that makes a whole lot of intellectual mess. But let's look at their claim. First of all, we have the constitutional amendment to ban same-sex marriage. As I noted the other day at a hearing, the Financial Services Committee was having a hearing, and the question of the Senate's refusal to take up the bill improving regulation of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac was brought up, and several of my Republican colleagues complained, I think legitimately, that the Senate is not acting on this bill. And I said, yes, I would hope that when the Senate is through preventing me from wrecking marriages all over America, that they would then find time to do some serious legislating on other subjects. But let's look at the content of the marriage amendment. George Bush, when he describes it, says it is to prevent activist judges from deciding this question. He also says it's to prevent one state from imposing its views on another. Both of those are lies. When they were originally propagated, they were probably examples of ignorance. But after a year or so of saying things that are blatantly wrong, ignorance becomes a lie, even if only by negligence. I mean, at some point, you do have to take account of the fact you're not telling the truth. First, let's look at this argument that the constitutional amendment against marriage is to prevent judges from making the decision. In Massachusetts, we have now had same-sex marriage for more than 2 years. Now, the opponents of same-sex marriage are really divided into two groups. There are some people who are opposed to same-sex marriage because they really dislike the fact that there are any homosexuals. And since they don't like the idea of there being one of us, they hate the idea of two of us hanging out. That's all we're talking about. There is a broader group that is worried by the predictions of social chaos. Now, one of the things, I hope, if there are academics here, please assign some people. Let's do some of this research. Let's substantiate it. I've gotten a Massachusetts legislature in 1972. I have worked in the last 34 years on legislation dealing with protection against racial discrimination, age discrimination, gender discrimination, discrimination based on disability, sexual orientation, and gender identity discrimination. In every single case, the opponents predict chaos, and it never happens. They make the same predictions time after time, and the media allows them to get away with it. Would somebody please go back and just do the study of how the same arguments come up every time? And as we know, those of you in particular who litigate this, the sad truth is that once we get an anti-discrimination piece of legislation on the books, it is almost always under-enforced, because the bigots learn how to be sophisticated and make it hard for us to meet the burden of proof. But marriage is in that same situation. Yes, in Massachusetts there were people who were afraid of it before it happened, because I heard all these respectable people predict what a terrible thing it would be. And now we've had it for 2 years and 3 months, and by overwhelming consensus, marriage is now understood, same-sex marriage, to be entirely boring to everyone who was not in one. Human nature being what it is, also to some who are. But we didn't guarantee them any exemption from the normal rules. If we were to have a referendum in Massachusetts today on same-sex marriage, I am certain it would win. Our legislature may prevent that from happening, because our state legislature, we had an election in 2004 in which same-sex marriage was a major issue. Our governor tried to make it a major issue. It was several months after it had gone into effect. Nobody lost because he or she was for same-sex marriage. Several people lost because they were against it in Democratic primaries in a couple of cases. The legislature elected in 2004, in a campaign in which same-sex marriage was an issue, is overwhelmingly supportive of same-sex marriage. But George Bush's amendment would cancel it out. If that amendment would have passed, marriage is one man and one woman, all the marriages that took place in Massachusetts would be retroactively canceled, even if in a referendum we voted for it. So let's not have this nonsense about it's aimed at activist judges. It would overrule anything that a state did by no matter what democratic process. It's also, of course, the case that the full faith and credit clause has not been held to apply, almost certainly will not be held to apply, and in fact, marriage has not spread. In fact, you listen to the Bush administration, they act as if marriage is just going to whip across the country like wildfire, another one of these reversals. They are more worried about infection from same-sex marriage than from avian flu. I wish we could get their priorities somewhat reversed as to what's likely to cross state lines. That's symptomatic of this phony invocation by the right wing of, oh, we want to be with the people. One of the most angry debates we had in Congress in reaction to a court decision, Bobby Scott will remember this, was after the eminent domain decision. You remember what a firestorm that caused. That's a major cause for your more conservative counterparts. What did the court say there? The court said, you know what? What the elected and appointed officials in Connecticut did is okay. As I said to my conservative colleagues, your problem here is where was activism when you needed it? Their objection was that the courts upheld the decisions of the elected and appointed officials. What they wanted was to overturn that. Their eminent domain position would put the courts in a position of canceling out decisions by elected and appointed officials all across the country. Leave aside the merits. They wanted more activism. Of course, the fact that the people of Oregon twice in referenda ratified their assisted suicide law didn't stop Manny, Mo, and Jack from trying to overturn it in the Supreme Court. They are as activist as anybody they criticize. I will say I was in a panel discussion being filmed for later showing with Justice Scalia, and I made that argument. And he said, well, that's not my argument. You're mischaracterizing my argument. I said, well, I've heard a lot of people say that. He said, you've never heard me say that, have you? I said, well, I haven't been following you that closely. But the point is that when they use this rhetoric, when the courts uphold locally elected decisions that they do not like, they are very angry. This notion that they are for letting the people decide rather than the judges is simply wholly fraudulent. It is, of course, the case also that in the 11th Amendment jurisdiction, the right of the states, as you know, to ignore federal laws that say they can't discriminate. They have been more activist. They have knocked out more federal laws. And at one point, there was a footnote that I read. I try to remember who said it. Because the 11th Amendment does say that you can't, someone from one state can't sue another state. It does not say textually that you can't sue your own state. And I think Breyer said, what are you talking about? It says right here you can't sue your own state. And one of the conservatives said he was being overly literal in his reading of the Constitution. Go back and find in the 11th Amendment jurisdiction. So, again, don't give them the argument of morality in politics, and don't concede to them on the public issue. Last point I want to make is, and I want to defend from the democratic standpoint, because democracy really is to me a very important principle. I want to defend the model that we have followed in Massachusetts and elsewhere, where the courts take the lead in some of these issues. The notion that these public policies are imposed by the courts over the objection of the electorate, those are at best true only temporarily. I cannot think of a case in American history where the courts have long been able to sustain a policy when the majority of the voters consistently didn't like it. It is certainly the case in virtually every state I know of. It's true in Massachusetts. It was true in Hawaii in '96. It's even truer there because at the state level, amending state constitutions is fairly easy in many cases. And so if a court issues a decision at the state constitutional level that's opposed by a majority, it won't last long. Remember, we have the Defense of Marriage Act, that wonderful phrase, which obviously distorts the whole purpose of this. That grew out of the Hawaii decision. Remember, the Hawaii Supreme Court looked like it might find same-sex marriage legal 10 years ago. Within a very short period of time, the voters of Hawaii overturned that. So, and here's, I think, the democratic justification for the courts doing this, in addition to the textual one, the right of protecting minority rights. I go back to what I said before. Every time we try to end discrimination against a particular group, we run into problems. Now, in most cases, the group will be an unpopular group to some extent. By definition, people generally don't discriminate against the people they like. I mean, or respect. Obviously, women are not, people don't dislike women, they just thought, at least the political community, they weren't too competent and you had to be careful about them. So you start out in a democratic system at some disadvantage when you are dealing with the victims of discrimination. As I say, in every case that I am aware of, in every form of discrimination, arguments have been made that it would produce chaos. My favorite was Pat Robertson on the Americans with Disabilities Act. And Pat Robertson said, if you pass the Americans with Disabilities Act, the churches will have to hire homosexuals. Bill Hefner, who was a great Democrat from North Carolina, who was in his last term then, he figured he could tell the truth. He said, Bill had been a gospel singer. He said, going to make the church hire homosexuals. Who the hell does he think's been playing the organ all these years? But here's the democratic justification. You have, in many cases, a majority that does not bear the victims of discrimination ill will, but they have heard from respectable people, government officials and church leaders and academics and others, that if they grant this particular minority this particular legal protection, it will be chaotic. And even when people are sympathetic to a minority group, very few of us have the degree of empathy to live somebody else's lives, to feel somebody else's pain. So it is hard to get people to say, well, I'll risk some chaos. Here's where the courts come in. What we have seen happen is that the courts order, in some cases, an end to the discrimination, or at least a diminution of it. And in almost every case, certainly at the state level, ultimately, the democratic process will be able to overturn that. There'll be a referendum. There'll be a vote in the legislature. There'll be new justices appointed. In Vermont, it meant that the justices who decided the civil union case came up for repeat appointment by the legislature. And the democratic justification is this. What the courts can do when they seek to protect minorities against discrimination is not immunize minorities forever against an eternally hostile public. They give the minorities a chance to show that public that the anti-discrimination measures will not be chaotic. And in many, many cases, after 3 or 4 or 2 years of experience, the opposition dwindles. And that, I think, is how democracies ought to work. It is that leaving aside, as I said, the textual right of minorities, because, in fact, in our system, if the courts issue a particular minority protection and it remains unpopular, it will not last. And that's one of the things we have to understand, those of us who are engaged in defending the rights of the judicial system. You can win the initial victories in the judicial system. You win a tryout. But if we are not simultaneously very active in the political system, we will lose through the electoral system virtually anything we gain through the judicial system unless we provide the backup. Fortunately, when we go to the electoral system with the experience of the anti-discrimination in practice, we're better able to win it than if we went there from the beginning. And that's clearly where we are. So I just would close by saying, in summary, we need to take the arguments to them and get off the defensive. People ought to talk about, in the eminent domain case, how the number of local officials who exercise eminent domain is enormous. The mayors are very exercised about this effort to cut back on eminent domain. There are very few cases in America where the conservative judicial position, and there may be people here who don't like eminent domain, I'm leaving aside the substance of it myself, they are totally opposed to what the public wants on that. With regard to the Terry Schiavo case and the Oregon-assisted suicide case, many of the conservatives operate from a theological position that says your life is a gift from God and God maintains a no-return policy. I mean, that's essentially what they're saying. You cannot decide, okay, enough, I've had it. They, therefore, will use the law to prevent anything that terminates life at any stage with any human volition. Now, that turns out to be, we now know after the Schiavo case, and we learned it in the Oregon case, a very unpopular position. In fact, I think Bill Frist's presidential campaign was destroyed by his problems in the Schiavo case. Of course, later on he had his investment issue, and he was in the unfortunate position, talk about the vision thing, he said that Terry Schiavo was not blind, and she was, and he said his investment trust was blind, and it wasn't, and he just wasn't able to survive the contrast. But it is the conservative wing that holds a very unpopular position with regard to whether or not human beings have any right to say enough with regard to life. They hold a very unpopular position in terms of the public with regard to the rights for people to be protected against state government discrimination. They are talking not about morality in politics, but about intruding into our private lives in ways that people increasingly don't like. So, as I say, I'm delighted that people are here, and I believe, and I would not have been as confident as saying this if this were November of 2004. I might have appeared cheerful, but I would be lying, because I wasn't sure that there was not a consensus against us on more of these issues. By the way, even the same-sex marriage thing seems to have fallen flat. The notion, people aren't afraid of it anymore. People now, again, there are two views here. There are some people who just think same-sex marriage is a shameful thing and ought to be rooted out wherever it exists. That's the position Bush has adopted. It turned out the majority was saying, hey, look, those wackos in Massachusetts want to go play with each other, let them, but I don't want it in Nebraska. Well, that's the way the world is right now. I mean, there are differentiations. Their extremism and their insistence on imposing their views on others, I think, makes them very vulnerable. So as you continue to make the legal arguments, and there has been a tendency on the liberal side and the civil liberty side to figure, well, we better retreat to the courts as our bastion because there be dragons out in the electoral process. No, there aren't anymore. On a lot of these issues, we do have the popular position, which is fortunate because, as I said, they would not be long-term sustainable without them. So in your efforts of a joint sort of legal and political defense of the kind of society we want to live in, I wish you good luck, and I think you're going to have it. Thank you.